In 1908, Tell City celebrated its 50th birthday with a homecoming parade and city festivities. Time and progress brought changes to the town. Old customs and businesses vanished to make way for the new, and the next 50 years saw dramatic changes. Oh, the mighty Ohio, the lifeline of the community and the founding fathers' haven. But the mighty Ohio is as vicious as serene. Floods in 1907 caused damage to local factories, and in 1913 a flood covering Main Street was thought to be the worst Tell City would ever see. And for 24 years it was. Then in 1937, the granddaddy of them all brought 3 feet more water than in 1913 and a devastation of $900,000. This brought the Corps of Army Engineers and the flood wall to Tell City. The wall cost $850,000 and was completed in 1941. This event was celebrated with a parade. The winning float consisted of the high school glee club, directed by Miss Erna Colway, singing "Rivers, Stay Away from My Door." The wall was tested in 1945 when a flood, 5.5 feet lower than the 37 flood, resulted in 8 feet of water on the outside of the wall, but no water inside the city. Floods were not the only disaster the river brought. A severe winter in 1917-18 caused the river to freeze and remain so for 6 weeks. It began to seem as if we would never have a free river again. Dynamite was used to try to break an ice gorge near the Tell City Wharf. Workmen spent several anxious days and nights at the riverfront. The ferry boat, K&I, with a dock on each side, broke loose and moved down to the mouth of Lead Creek, and then to a point out from the U.S. Haim Company, later site of Maxim Marine. After this, every chain and rope in Tell City was put to use, tying up barges and ferry boats. Then alarming reports were received from Rome, Indiana. If the upriver gorges came downriver to Rome before the gorges there broke, Rome would be wiped off the map. Thankfully, that afternoon, the ice began to move from Rome and Rock Island to Tell City. In short time, a solid mass of ice, often piled 10 feet high above the water, was rapidly moving downriver. A large block of ice caught the steamer Alma, causing 2 chains to snap like paper, and she went down the ice. She was found the next morning in the willows just inside the corporate city limits. A large fire was built at the ferry landing in order to keep the workmen from freezing in the bitter cold night. With the aid of Bettinger's searchlights, piles of heaped ice could be seen floating downriver. By the end of the next day, the ice was gone, leaving only small cakes floating. It was thought for sure that the 5 men aboard the K&I had been lost, but luckily the ferry landed safely in a cornfield near Newburgh. When rail service came here in 1899, the importance of the river began to wane. Packet boats had been the source of deliveries. After World War I, this service dwindled, and by 1932, only one boat, the Sutherland, stopped at Tell City. The Sutherland burned in 1932 and no boat replaced her, thus bringing an end to the era of the packet boat. River activity came to a standstill, opening the way for a new era. In the early 1900s, when the horse and buggy was the mode of transportation, the Werner and Birchler Livery Stable did a thriving business. This location would later become Werner Motor Company. After their wooden structure burned in 1908, a brick building was built which housed as many as 40 horses and vehicles for hire. Gaily painted bandwagons, spring wagons, wagonettes, and last but not least, the surrey with the fringe on top were used to take groups on all kinds of outings. For weddings, funerals, and dignitaries, only the hacks with the best horses in the stable were used. Sometimes young men would hire the fastest horses and smartest vehicles for Sunday afternoons in order to drive around town and impress the girls. Reservations had to be made weeks ahead. In the early days, the traveling salesman or drummer would arrive in Tell City on a Sunday evening via Southern Railway. After a night in the commercial hotel, he would start out early with horse and buggy for a week's trip, calling on county stores. Then in 1918, the livery stable was closed, and this ended the colorful era, making way for the automobile. Charlie Herman owned the first auto in Tell City. This Rambler arrived from Louisville on February 28, 1907. After driving it with much difficulty for a year, He parked it in a shed where it remained until he sold it in 1910. At that time, there were 4 cars in the town. The newfangled contraption caused the need for road and street improvement. This turnaround was installed at the end of Highway 37 so the driver could return the way he came. And of course, gas stations began to appear. In 1913, Charles Edwards of Cannelton, shown in the center, began to seriously study aviation and believed he could improve on the models of the day. He spent 2 years working on a model plane named the Edwards Hydroplane. 12 Tell City and Cannelton businessmen formed a company and advanced $2,000 to finance the Common Sense Aeroplane Company. On July 7, 1915, at 5:30 p.m., a crowd gathered on the riverbank at the U.S. Haim Company and waited in eager anticipation and excitement for the trial run. R.N. Wright of Washington, Indiana, said to be a relative of the Wright brothers, was hired to fly the plane. The plane moved slowly but surely, reaching a speed of 10 miles per hour, lifting slightly, then catapulting into the water and nearly drowning the pilot. 2 months later, another unsuccessful attempt was made to fly the plane, after which the project was abandoned and Edward turned to other pursuits. In the early 1900s, Tell City Chair Company was declared the largest manufacturer of double cane chairs in the world. Until 1930, when work in the home was banned, the cane seats were hand-woven at home by women. Tell City chair wagons would haul chair frames to all parts of the town. Ladies were paid with silver dollars since the exchange of money took place outdoors, and they didn't want the money to blow away. 1,000 chairs a week were made. The U.S. Brick Company, which began in 1907, was located on the north end of Main Street. 20 employees produced 40,000 bricks per day. Bricks were sent as far west as the Mississippi River, east to Cincinnati, north to Detroit, and south to Memphis. Fisher Chair Company is Tell City's oldest furniture plant, passing down through family generations. Even through the disastrous 37 flood, chairs were produced. This 1915 photo shows chairs being loaded onto boxcars for shipment. The Tell City Flouring Mill was erected in 1859, and by 1957 operated as a Tell City Feed and Grain elevator. This mill endured 2 destructive fires and rebuilt each time. Brand names of King Bee and Famous were household words in this area. After a 1956 fire, the company decided to concentrate entirely on animal feed. Chrysler Manufacturing Company began in 1865 producing toys, then buggy hubs. After a 1920 fire, they rebuilt and began manufacturing swings and lawn and porch furniture. After World War II, the company reorganized as the Tell City Planing Mill, no longer producing lawn furniture. William Tell Woodcrafters, originally known as Southwestern Furniture, began in 1873. In 1945, Charles N. Borders took over as manager, and by 1958, the plant organized for the production of television cabinets and hi-fis. Since 1943, Maxon had been designing and making towboats and barges. The plant, located on the 17-acre site previously belonging to the U.S. Haim Company, which left after the 1937 flood. The government was in need of 39 oil barges for the war effort. On May 29, 1943, the first barge was launched. The plant had 1,500 employees who managed to launch 39 more barges by October of that year. Maxon continued to build barges for the Navy, and in 1947 they launched their first towboat, the Tell City. The company continued through the second 50 years as one of our main manufacturers, employing an average of 200 people. The Knott Manufacturing Company occupied the property that was formerly built for the Sanitary Washing Machine Company. This modern marvel, built to relieve ladies of the tub and washboard, cost $10.20 each. Knott began building wooden toilet seats at this location in 1911. On January 24, 1944, Kenrad began production of goods used by the armed forces. The work schedule was 10 hours a day, 5.5 days a week. After World War II, General Electric purchased the plant and increased production. In 1958, GE employed 2,000 workers with a payroll of over $6 million. A highlight occurred in 1955 when Ronald Reagan visited the plant. Reagan was the program director of the popular television show GE Television Theater. Cutter Boats began manufacturing the newest type of pleasure boat in April of 1957. This was a community effort, with individual and business donations funding the establishment of the company. More than 500 people showed up at a town hall meeting in support of this endeavor. With the growth of population, there was a need for larger and more modern school buildings. In 1909, the Old South School was replaced by Franklin School. This new building had water fountains, indoor plumbing, and central heat. The upstairs housed the high school students, and the elementary students were on the first floor. The Old North School was replaced in 1923 by Newman School, which was named after Superintendent Christian Newman. He is the second from left in this photo of the Tell City High School faculty of 1914. Mr. Newman served the school system for 31 years and promoted the accrediting of high school in Tell City. Prior to 1905, Tell City High School students attended Cannelton High School in order to meet college entrance requirements. Mr. Newman proposed a course of study to ensure the Tell City High School could become commissioned. The first graduating class, consisting of 3 people, was in 1905. At the cornerstone laying of Newman School in 1914, it was said that Professor Newman caught pneumonia, which later resulted in his death. In 1905, Mr. Newman was instrumental in starting a city library. This started with the school board, and the Tell City Council voted in a tax in order to accumulate $900 for the endeavor. The library started in 1 room in City Hall, later expanding to 2 rooms. Initially, this was an ideal arrangement, but as City Hall began to be used for other purposes, the surroundings became too noisy. After much work on the part of the school board, the Carnegie Corporation made a grant of $10,000 for the construction of a new library. The city furnished a lot on the corner of 9th and Franklin Streets, and the library opened in October of 1917. This location currently houses the Tell City Historical Society Museum. A new high school was built in 1928 on a city-owned block of land. The first graduation took place there in 1929. The city's Swiss apple and arrow design is used throughout the architecture of the building. The theme, William Tell Marksman, is still used today. Although Tell City schools were never officially segregated, the black citizens began their own schools in 1872 on 10th Street. Later it was moved to 12th and then to Tell Street, as is shown here. By 1938, the schools were once again integrated. St. Paul Catholic School is the oldest continuous school in the city. Beginning in 1859, it was staffed by laywomen. In 1877, a 5-room brick building was built, and in 1914 replaced by a more modern 8-room structure. Additions were added in 1930 and 1958. The school eventually came under the city school system. In 1923, St. Paul's Church purchased the Volk Krogman residence and a lot at 8th and Jefferson, and used this as a rectory until 1952. A brick convent at 9th and Fulton Street was built in 1915. A new church and rectory were completed in 1953 and dedicated in 1954. Tell City's oldest Protestant congregation, the First Evangelical Church, had quickly outgrown its original brick church, and a new building was dedicated in 1907. Sunday school rooms were added in 1924. During the 1937 flood, the church opened its doors to families whose homes were flooded. Beds were provided and meals were served daily. In 1944, the Memorial Benevolent Fund in memory of Chris Finn was established. The fund continues to provide hospital equipment to anyone who needs it for as long as needed without charge. Mergers brought name changes to the church, and now it is the Evangelical United Church of Christ. In July of 1923, the little white church on the corner, built in 1893, was torn down to make way for the new Methodist church at 10th and Mozart Streets. The building was completed at a cost of $30,000 and was dedicated in 1924. A new parsonage was completed in 1953. The First Baptist Church was founded in 1921 with 44 charter members, and was the first of many congregations to hold services in City Hall. Their building at 13th and Jefferson Streets was completed in 1939. Also meeting in City Hall was the Tell City Church of Christ, organized in 1925. A framed church building at 1142 10th Street was purchased from an African American congregation in 1934, and members met there until 1945, where the current church at 10th and Lafayette Streets was completed. Later, the house next door was purchased for use as a parsonage. A Society for Christian Science was organized in 1920 and met in City Hall. In 1932, a brick residence on 9th Street was purchased, remodeled, and used for church purposes. In 1925, a group of Seventh-day Adventists began meeting in local homes and formed a new church with 22 charter members. For the next 15 years, meetings were held 3 times weekly at City Hall. In 1942, the Jarville School on 15th Street was purchased for the church. The current church at 13th and Humboldt Streets was built in 1949. In August 1941, City Hall became home to a branch Sunday school established by St. John's Lutheran Church of Evanston, Indiana. Evening services led by the pastors of St. John's were also held in City Hall during World War II. An organizational meeting was held in 1951, and Emmanuel was chosen as the congregational name. The cornerstone containing historical documents was laid for the new church at the corner of 12th and Petzolazzi Streets in 1952. Trustees of the Trinity Pentecostal Church purchased property at the corner of 15th and Jefferson Street in December 1944. The small church building continued to be home to the small but dedicated congregation and its first pastor, Reverend Herbert Thurber, for many years. After the stock market crash of 1929, the federal government established the Civil Works Administration. A local committee was formed to distribute food and clothing to the needy and administer building projects. The first project was to cut down the hill on Humboldt Street between 9th and 10th. The wooden chicken steps were eliminated, and the higher ground was made accessible to pedestrians and automobiles. The cut was 15 feet in some places, and much of the digging was done with picks and shovels. The inefficient CWA was soon replaced by the Public Works Administration, which funded a playground at Franklin School. 5 to 7 feet were removed in order to bring it level with the existing school building. In 1935, the WPA and the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, were created. In the 1400 block of 9th and 10th Streets was Camp William Tell, one of over 4,000 CCC camps nationwide. The men lived in the barracks while accomplishing various tasks. Street curbs, improvements to Legion Field, and a municipal swimming pool were some of the projects. In spite of difficult times, progress was being made. The Indiana-Kentucky Natural Gas Corporation was granted a gas franchise in Tell City in 1929. In 1935, Indiana Bell, providing service here since 1920, introduced the handset to replace crank-type phones. The 450 phones of the 1930s became 1,000 by 47 and 2,500 in 1957. In 1958, Tell City became the second community in Indiana to introduce direct dialing. All in all, Tell City businesses fared well considering the conditions of this time. None of our local banks had to close permanently. However, in 1933, a national bank holiday was declared. Banks closed for a period of time to prevent widespread withdrawal of funds. During this period, Tell City Chair Company paid chair caners with this scrip. It was used in local stores as money. After banks reopened, the scrip was redeemed for money. This scrip was circulated as far as Harrisburg, Illinois, Owensboro, Kentucky, and Evansville. Love of music was evident in early years by the popularity of numerous bands. The well-known Mechanics Silver Band continued its heritage in 1909 with the formation of the Junior Mechanics Band under Joseph Muchka. The Muchka family was prominent for over 4 generations. Their very own family orchestra played for civic affairs and social gatherings throughout several counties. Instrumental music was introduced in schools in 1929. Claude B. Smith was band director and organized the first Tell City High School band, known as the Marching Marksmen. Over the years, the band has won many contests and has performed in various national events. The band had strong community support and an active band parents group. There were singing groups which introduced the Society for the Preservation and Encouragement of Barbershop Singing in America. The local barbershop singers were chartered in 1946. In 1952, the Sweet Adelines, directed by Dixie Davis, organized with 8 members. Because of expensive national dues, they relinquished their charter and became locally known as the Swiss Adelines. The Dixie Davis Dance Band became well known in the 1930s. Dixie Davis was one of Southern Indiana's best pianists, gaining fame while at Purdue University. He wrote the Marksman school song, "Tell City, We're Mighty Proud of You." In 1955, the Tell City String Ensemble was organized when Mrs. Georgia Nyford, far left, a talented cellist, encouraged others to join. The ensemble was in demand to play in neighboring communities for programs and dinner music. This 1910 operation depicts the medical advantages Tell City had to offer. Assisting Dr. Walter Cluth, Jr. is Nurse Carrie Becker-Ress. Through the years, Tell City has been fortunate to have physicians, dentists, and optometrists who practice here. Early doctors not only served from their offices, but also made house calls. Drugstores such as Dusch, Schreiber, and Werner had 3 and 4 generations of family pharmacists who served our community. In 1918, the worst influenza epidemic in Tell City was brought on by returning World War I soldiers who carried the Spanish influenza back to our area. Dr. F.C. Glenn, health officer, ordered all churches, schools, and picture shows to be closed. Red Cross volunteers went into homes of those stricken, and those who avoided the illness pitched in to help the less fortunate. 500 to 600 people were stricken, and there were 18 deaths in the first 2 weeks of the epidemic. In later years, smallpox and polio epidemics occurred, but worse was the spinal meningitis that occurred in 1931. This caused 7 Tell City deaths. The Indiana State Board of Health visited the town and implemented a rigid quarantine. When Dr. N.A. James located in Tell City, he felt the city needed a hospital. City and county officials had no funds for this project, so Dr. and Mrs. James established their own. The Parkview was founded at the corner of 9th and Jefferson Streets in the building once housing Becker Brothers. People told him it would not last 6 months, but for 30 years he continued to buy equipment as he could, and for a hospital of that size, it was well equipped. When Perry County Memorial Hospital opened in 1950, he closed the Parkview and continued his private practice on the first floor of the building, and in 1954 was joined by his son, Dr. John Mark James. Tell City's Company 1, 2nd Indiana Infantry, was among the last of America's all-volunteer army. They were called to service in June of 1917 and led by Captain Sid Cummings, 1st Lieutenant Volmar Franz, and 2nd Lieutenant Edwin Patrick. The mechanics band, followed by Tell City citizens, marched to the depot to see the men off as they left for the Mexican border to protect against the raids of Pancho Villa. In 1917, after a German U-boat sank the ocean liner Lusitania, killing 128 Americans, the United States entered World War I. The 1st Infantry became part of the Federal Army and was sent to Europe to serve. One of our heroes, Private Henry Strobel, Company D of the 120th Infantry, received the Distinguished Service Cross and numerous citations for heroism in France. The war ended on November 11, 1918. 805 Perry County men served in World War I. World War II began for the United States after the bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. Earl Davis, a 21-year-old sailor aboard a ship at Pearl Harbor, became the first Perry County man to become injured. He spent his recuperation encouraging other Tell City men to enlist. Major General Edwin Patrick distinguished himself in the South Pacific, where he received the Medal of Honor. General Patrick became the only Indiana general killed in ground combat. He was returned to Greenwood Cemetery for burial. On the home front, war bonds were being sold and hardships encountered with rationing of automobiles, tires, sugar, bicycles, and gasoline. Gasoline was plentiful, but there was a problem getting it delivered because German U-boats had taken a heavy toll on our tankers. Sugar was scarce because 1/3 of our sugar came from the Philippines and was no longer available. Ration coupons were issued by the federal government, allowing each person to use them for their allotted weekly share of these items. Local businesses gave coupon book holders to their customers. Factories had turned to production of war products, so cars, washing machines, and even typewriters were not being manufactured and were only available to those using them for vital war and community service. The Japanese had control of 97% of our rubber supplies, and what remained was used for the war effort. One bomber required as much rubber as 36 passenger cars. Since autos were in short supply, bicycle demand grew. Now they were only available to those using them to go to work. Tell City had many decorated heroes who served their country, and we should not forget the several local women who served in our military and as military nurses. The National World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. lists more than 80 Tell City names who gave their lives for their country. Then Japan surrendered, the war officially ended in 1945, and citizens celebrated. By 1950, we became embroiled in the Korean War. This was never declared a war and was called a police action, but the men who served there knew it was war. Local men served in various capacities, and one local airman miraculously survived an air crash. Nearly 40 local men lost their lives in World War I. More than 80 died in World War II. The Korean War claimed 16 of our local men. To all who served, we say thanks. In 1909, the Fraternal Order of Oddfellows celebrated their 50-year anniversary. By 1955, they boasted 129 members. The Knights of Pythias are shown attending this 1920 banquet. They built a building at Main and Washington Streets where they held their meetings. The organization promoted friendship, charity, and benevolence. The Masonic Lodge met in the Troy Lodge building for 25 years, until the current building was completed in 1938. The lodge was presented with a wooden gavel said to have come from a tree planted by Abraham Lincoln. This was presented in memory of A.P. Finn and is on display at the temple on 9th and Mozart Streets. The Loyal Order of the Moose was established in 1913 with 50 members. After rapid growth, the members erected a building at 10th and Jefferson, which was completed in 1917. They sponsored our Schweitzer-Fest beer garden for the 1958 centennial. Here we see the Knights of Columbus in this 1924 picture. In later years, the organization acquired a building at Tell and 11th Streets. The Tell City Kiwanis Club started in 1927. 2 years later, they started the Christmas Basket Program, which delivers baskets to the needy of the community and is still active today. The Hoosier Heights Country Club was founded in 1928. Land was purchased and a golf course constructed. A clubhouse was then built. The most original organization has to be the Last Man's Club. In 1923, a group wishing to meet with old friends over the Christmas holidays decided to organize. At their first meeting, the Toastmaster proclaimed, "Let's eat, gang," and they adopted that for the name. In 1936, the membership numbered 45. They then changed the name to the Last Man's Club. The Tell City Jaycees, a civic organization, began in 1950 with 65 members. Projects include Main Street Christmas decorations, Christmas parade, and 4th of July picnic. Our first patriotic organization was the American Red Cross, founded in 1917 during World War I. Workshops throughout the country prepared and shipped badly needed hospital and surgical supplies. During World War II, the Red Cross provided contact between soldiers, overseas, and their families. And of course, during the 1937 flood, food, clothing, medical supplies, and household goods were supplied. Tell City's largest patriotic organization, American Legion Post 213, dates back to 1919. A membership numbering 215 began meeting in City Hall. They built a building on Highway 66 in the 1930s. The American Legion purchased property, developed a modern athletic field, and donated it to the school corporation, and Legion Field still remains as a tribute to their generosity. They also sponsored American Legion Baseball. By 1922, the Legion Auxiliary was formed, and the Sons of the American Legion was established in 1932. Winchell Vogel Veterans of Foreign War Post was organized in 1934 and met in City Hall. Around 1948, they moved to the location on Main Street. An auxiliary was formed soon after this. The VFW and auxiliary regularly support our schools, the Boy Scouts, VA medical and cancer groups, sponsor essay contests, and provide American flags for public use. Always an important part of Tell City life, sports have provided much enjoyment throughout the years. Although modern-day sports include anything one can vision, the early years were dedicated to baseball, basketball, and football. Baseball teams were a part of early Tell City life and had a large following. Tell City had spawned some professional players. Former Mayor Nick Beimel was the most famous, playing for 27 years in professional leagues before coaching Tell City's semi-pro team, the Tell City Grays. The Grays won pennants in 1946, 47, and 52. Chester Big Six Limegruber, center front, was well known for throwing a ball like a bullet. He contributed to many no-hit, no-run games. Basketball started in the 1920s on an outdoor court, moved to the not-so-spacious Newman School gym in 1923, and later to the high school stage, then to the new Tell City Gym, which was completed in 1955. Several college players of note came from here. Among them were Charles Red Labhart, number 22 in this photo, played for Western Kentucky Hilltoppers, William Schaefer for Indiana Central, Art Wagner for Oakland City, and Burke Scott was instrumental in helping the Hoosiers win the Big Ten Conference and the NCAA Championship in 1953. Bill Netzel, number 5, went on to play for Purdue. The first girls basketball team was formed in 1924 and only played 2 games. The team had 9 players, a business manager, a female chaperone, and was coached by Clyde Walters. 6-man football was organized in 1938. Games were played on the baseball field at the north end of town at the corner of 9th and Payne. Ray Eddy, who coached the basketball team, was the first coach. Eddy went on to become Purdue University's head basketball coach. The 6-man team became 8-man, and in 1939 moved to the Legion Athletic Field, which had night lighting. The first 11-man team took the field at Huntingburg on September 12, 1952. The September 22, 1922 issue of the Tell City News tells of a feud that ended in the murder of James James. 37 bullet wounds to his wife and wounds to 2 children. Frank Jennett was charged. It seems that the 2 families had been feuding for years. Frank and James had married sisters, and they lived half-mile apart. The 2 families fought so much, their neighbors tried to avoid them. On this particular morning, one of the James boys went to find a horse that had gotten out. This led him to the Jennett property, where he exchanged words with Jennett. From here, the story is conflicted, But what resulted is that the Jennett family went to the James household and began firing, and the bloodbath ensued. Here we see the James coffin in front of their home. Ernest Morawek, shown with his mother and sister, became a noted ear, nose, and throat doctor. He inherited the first-class Morawek Hotel from his father, Anton. After his first wife died of a heart attack, Dr. Morawek spent time traveling between here, a farm in Kentucky, and to Europe, where his reputation as a doctor grew. However, his business dealings were questionable. He was named executor of his cousin's estate, but ended up getting sued for a missing $5,000, which he had to repay. Then he laid claim to a $25,000 villa in Germany, which belonged to a wealthy German widow he had met. She later visited the United States, where by chance he met with her again and offered to show her the USA. She ended up visiting his farm, where she died of a heart attack. According to Dr. Morawek, she had added a codicil to her will, leaving him her villa. Following her wishes to be cremated, he returned her ashes to her family in Germany, who certainly contested this codicil. Nonetheless, it is believed that 3 years later he sold the villa and had this money with him when he purchased a ticket on the Titanic. Reportedly, Dr. Morawek made friends with Kate Buss while on board. The last time she saw him was when he stated he was going to find out what the ship had hit. His body was never found. He was 54. The year is 1921, and Citizens Bank is requesting information regarding Alphonse Scherer, who absconded with over $8,000 in cash and $18,500 in bonds. He is described as a neat dresser, a good pool player, belonged to the Moose, Oddfellows, Masons, and Knights of Pythias, and is shifty-eyed. Last seen in Los Angeles, California. Mrs. Anna Schreiber decided to drive their new car around the block one day, and at the other end of the block, Mrs. Ray Steiner happened to do the same thing. They met somewhere in the middle, head-on. The husbands were called, and they managed to get the cars pulled apart and set back on the road. The men went back to work. A few minutes later, a man rushed in to tell Mr. Schreiber that his wife had crashed into Mrs. Ray Steiner. "Oh yes," he replied, "we have already taken care of that." "Oh no, you don't understand. They have crashed into each other again." After this, the ladies decided to stop driving until they had some lessons. We hope it wasn't Mr. Ray Steiner, known as Stinky, who gave the lessons though. He ran the local machine shop and was giving lessons to one gentleman who didn't know how to stop his car. He kept driving round and round the block. Each time he would pass the machine shop, he would yell, "Stinky, come stop me." Stinky's reply, "Just go around again. I'm too busy right now." Our second 50 years ended as it began, with a city celebration. Week-long festivities included parades, fashion shows, dances, a beer garden, and other events, which began our yearly tradition, the Schweitzer Fest.